So good morning, friends, and warm welcome to this very, very important session of Delhi 5. Actually, I see this not just because it is close to my heart, but also because this is one of the key recommendations of Buenos Aires Plan of Action that we adopted in Buenos Aires a couple of weeks back. And this is absolutely essential as we move forward in terms of our engagement with South-South cooperation. So this, I think, is extremely important. Governments are waiting for our recommendation. There is a growing traction, as we heard Secretary Economic Relations yesterday. Government of India is very keen not only to see what direction we are going in, but they are also very interested in the South-South cooperation projects which are being delivered in different countries by the South-South partnership mechanism. Three issues they are confronting. One, as we heard the minister, that they should be delivered when they are needed most. So usually not so much in case of China, but definitely in case of India, we see delays in the project implementation and how we can deliver them well in time when they are required. Second important issue is when this is delivered, what kind of impact it is leaving behind. In the session that we had last evening, we heard about not only ex ante and ex post analysis, but also during the project's implementation phase, if we can have the assessment possible. And this makes the task of the academics who are working on impact assessment all the more challenging. The third point is about the very idea of abiding by the principles. And as we have been taking a position in NEST, the impact assessment for South-South cooperation should be done at two levels. One, it has to be sensitive to the principles of South-South cooperation. We heard enough about the principles of South-South cooperation, and I'm sure my panel would also be capturing those principles, so I'm not getting into that. But definitely it is important for us to see what principles, what modalities, what kind of indicators to capture whether principles are being followed, and what indicators for capturing details of modalities. So this kind of four-point matrix is extremely important when we are going for impact assessment of South-South cooperation. So when we are doing that, it is important that countries, though it is very difficult, as we heard yesterday, to abide by those principles, because principles are, after all, a statement of intent, and that is difficult when you go on the ground. So to keep you on the track and to keep you on the track to follow those principles and do the course correction when projects are moving forward is absolutely full with challenges. And that's where role of academics and role of institutions like NEST that comes forward. In context of India, we are trying to do that through the Forum for Indian Development Cooperation, FIDC, and I requested my colleague Kostov to join this panel, who is very actively working on issues that are related to India's development cooperation as a civil society member, and that is absolutely fascinating, because then you bring in the heft of the various institutional perspectives when assessments are to be done. We also heard yesterday that India's Prime Minister announced in Uganda a 10-point principal agenda for India's engagement with Africa. We have captured that. We have published the details in the Development Cooperation Review in our publication, and there are many more commentaries already written on India's this 10 principal agenda with Africa, and that I think is important. Last point that I want to mention here is the need to visit the development perspective afresh, and I'm very glad my dear friend, though very often just to pull him, we say that he's on the other side of the stream. But I think at times, if ideas are converging, there is no point in not doing the handshake that is required. And I'm really looking at Mario Pezzani here, who very rightly pointed out yesterday to revisit the development model. The Anglo-Saxon development model requires to be revisited. The prescriptive approaches of the development model and the theorization done by the Western scholars, that requires to be revisited, not just because the damage it has done in South America and many other places through the structural adjustment program, but because of the absence of endogeneity in the process. And that endogeneity, local resources, local sort of leveraging of technology and due space for local employment, that gives the heft that is required for development model. It is also very important when we see that these development projects do not deliver to the local expectations, a disconnect appears. And we have seen this in case of ODA. So how we go forward is something that South requires, and I'm glad that this panel is trying to capture that question of local connect of development cooperation, providing that necessary policy space which is needed for discussing the scope for we to move forward, and not just saying in principles that this is based on local demand. So local demand is not an induced demand. Local demand is delivering to the local requirements and answering to the local aspirations and hopes. That's where the democratization of the development cooperation architecture comes in, and that's where we need to see that South-South cooperation remains on that track. It follows that track which is required. My friend reflected that yesterday evening in the session on triangular cooperation when we heard the experience of Afghanistan, and Dr. Kabiri did point out this perspective of localization. At RIS, two of my senior colleagues, Dr. P.K. Anand and Mr. Krishna Kumar, are following this question from the perspective of sustainable development goals. And localization of SDGs reflect the very ambition we have in terms of bringing in development cooperation, dovetailing the development agenda as all of us are committed for SDGs. So that way you have the right ecosystem which requires to be nurtured and not regimentized, but definitely some sort of guiding principles and touchstones that were listed yesterday, I think are absolutely important. In our background note and also in agenda this time, you might have seen a new column that we have added with questions, and those questions are there for my panel as well in terms of how we are going to go forward on assessment process. The background note raises some 6 or 7 questions. The title of the conference is South-South and Triangular Cooperation. And yesterday evening, those who were in the session on triangular cooperation would very much recall the discussion that we had about the idea of triangular cooperation not equivalent to South-South cooperation. And Professor Gladys did mention this point very forcefully, that SSC plus TRC is not equivalent to development cooperation. So those distinctions, those uniqueness are there, but they should not be dividing or pushing apart the possibility of we working together. And that's where the convergence possibilities, and that's where the BAPA plus 40 declaration comes out very clearly, very forcefully, that we have to work together. And that, I think, is absolutely essential for us to see how we follow the same track. Assessment is also becoming important, and that's my last point. Assessment is also very important because quantums have multiplied. South-South cooperation now is flowing with quantums which are unprecedented in the history of Second World War, post-Second World War time period that we have seen. Never before we have seen such quantums being pushed in. Now, as quantums multiply, the ability to ensure adherence to principles become all the more challenging. And when it becomes challenging, you are likely to navigate in some other direction if guiding principles and modality related indicators are not constantly telling you. I mean, they are just like your GPS. They should be telling you what direction you are really going in, and it has to be on real time basis. And that's where role of multi-stakeholder participation comes in. That's where the role of multiple institutional approaches come in, and role of indicators and assessment frameworks are important. Time has come when South cannot avoid this adherence to these principles and modalities. They have to have their framework. And with that, let me now begin the exercise that we are expected to have this morning, as I'm expecting more of my panel members. I do not know where they are stuck, but I hope they are being tracked. And though last night I was trying to see that people are having drinks that are sufficient to get them back here at 8:30, but I think some of my panel members are missing. Let them join, but it is, yes. Yes, exactly. No, we are not assessing. I'm not assessing anyone. So you do the assessment work. Professor Milindo, now we start with your presentation. As you know, Professor Milindo has been working on several dimensions of it. At times, we have to pull him back because he gets into the academic luxury of kite flying. So we have to tell him, Milindo, come back. This is policy discussion. So Professor Milindo, you have the floor. I'm not giving you time of the other speakers, so you continue with the 8 minutes.
I'm really privileged to have been given the opportunity to present the collective wisdom that we generated at RIS over the last couple of years on the issue of assessment template, norms, and plurality in SSC. The whole discussion that we had yesterday gave us three very important pointers regarding our looking into the issues related to South-South cooperation. Number one, it identifies the role of multiple actors, and from that perspective, emphasizes the need for a multilateral perspective towards South-South cooperation. On the other hand, the idea is that South-South cooperation cannot be thought of in the absence of effective people-to-people connect. So it is on the one hand a sort of a mechanism to join the nations together, and on the other hand, it is also an effort to join the individuals together in a sense of solidarity and development cooperation process. And the challenge of assessment framework for SSC has to be looked from this perspective. The challenge involves linking the nations on the one hand, and the challenge involves linking the people on the other hand. And the assessment framework is going to be the most important tool to facilitate these two processes simultaneously, which often appear to be working in divergence with one another. So that's the most important challenge that we face when we try to discuss about the assessment template for SSC. I have, this is the plan of my presentation. I would like to just touch upon the relevant issues from BAPA plus 40 outcome document, which gives us a clue as to how to move about and go around identifying an assessment template. I would like to emphasize on two very unique features of SSC that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about assessment template. And then we propose an assessment framework for SSC. And wearing my academic hat, I would also like to give some clues towards the way forward. The first three take care of my policy understanding hat, and the last one is a little bit of my academic understanding. So this is the relevant issue from BAPA plus 40 outcome document. It calls for consultation on country-led, non-binding, voluntary methodologies to assess impact of SSC. I would like to be very, very categorical on these three components. Number one, it has to be a consultation. Number two, it has to be country-led. Number three, it has to be non-binding and voluntary methodology. And the reasons are quite obvious. The reasons are, as Sachin categorically pointed out, that South-South cooperation, unlike the traditional model of development cooperation, does have a dynamism of its own. It's not static. It goes on moving, and it moves in a direction where there are certain fulcrums to be followed, and the rest of the actions and rest of the activities can be taken care of as and when they are required and the way they are necessary to be put into action. And the second point is also very, very important, that while we are considering an impact assessment framework, I am not using the term impact immediately right now, an assessment framework, we have to respect the diversity within SSC and within national approaches. So the diversity cannot just be thrown away, and this has to be a main plank of an assessment framework for SSC. Now, if you have a look at SSC, as Sachin rightly pointed out, that SSC is uniquely identified because of its two features. Number one, it has a set of guiding principles, and number two, there are pluralities in modalities of cooperation. How we cooperate and what should be the process of cooperation need not necessarily be a same structure of modalities followed by all the partners in South-South cooperation. Now, we tried to have a look at the several documents that are available, not just from the government organizations engaged in South-South cooperation, but also from different research organizations and think tanks who are engaged in the understanding to identify the guiding principles of SSC. You have been supplied with a discussion note, consultation note, where they are given in detail. Maybe many a times I will just skip them. But if you have a look at the guiding principles of SSC, you can simultaneously see that there are some variations across the different partners who are engaged in the process of South-South cooperation. The Ibero-Americans, the SEGI document on Ibero-American cooperation lists a good number of them. Then India also has some specific ideas of guiding principles. China has given some guiding principles in their own way. Brazil has their own, Mexico has developed some of them, and South Africa. Apparently, it may look that, well, there are some variations, but we are happy to note that if you go through a closer scrutiny of these guiding principles, many of them are expansion of some fundamental guiding principles, and they are put in a disaggregated manner, mostly in case of the Ibero-American structure of guiding principles, where you find that some of them are disaggregated to a level, but those can be ultimately aggregated into some fundamental ideas or guiding principles of SSC. So, if we have a detailed look at these different guiding principles suggested by different partner countries engaged in SSC, we can come to 6 common principles that are being followed by all the practitioners that we have identified over here in terms of their SSC activities. Number 1 is mutual benefit. Number 2 is national ownership or independence. Number 3, it is very important that South-South cooperation activities are demand-driven. There is a respect for national sovereignty. This, most importantly, the principle of non-conditionality is tried to be followed. And then you have horizontality or equality, as it has been argued by several groups. But more or less, they mean the same thing, that you maintain an equality of partnership while you are offering a South-South cooperation development process. So these are the common principles that are emerging. There are some of them which are further disaggregated at some levels, but these can safely be taken as the 6 guiding principles of South-South cooperation. And Professor Sachin rightly pointed out in the beginning that even though it is easy to identify the principles, often it is a question whether those guiding principles are really followed at the ground level, and whether there are deviations or not from the guiding principles per se. So, from that perspective, we are proposing some suggestive indicators for assessment. Of course, respecting the principle, but they are not exactly comparable with a measurable, quantifiable, or qualitative indicators, but these are some of the generic understanding of how the indicators can take shape in. Number 1, when we are talking about mutual benefit, the question that the indicator that we may like to talk about is to what extent it is creating market access for the partners. Mutual benefit can be looked at from that perspective. It is also expected to enhance knowledge, human capital, and production basis of the partner countries mutually. It can also contribute to the process of inclusion in the value chain of the partner countries together. If you talk about national ownership independence, whether the activities are compatible and to the compatibility with the national development strategy, as it was rightly pointed out in the morning, creation of local capacities and opportunities, how are they contributing to that process? Demand-driven, we may like to develop some indicators to understand the nature of demand, and in some indicators to understand the nature of responses to demand. Nature of demand arising from the recipient country, and the nature of responses to demand from the providing countries. Respect for national sovereignty can be understood from the perspective of maintenance of territorial integrity of the partner countries, imposition of economic, political costs on partner countries. Non-conditionality is conditional change in macroeconomic policies, and horizontality equality can be indicated in terms of the equality experience between partners and in decision-making process. So these are some of the candidate ideas for developing some candidate indicators in the context of the principles of South-South cooperation. There are pluralities in modalities as well. And needless to add, the pluralities are to be respected. how a country introduces its South-South cooperation activity can be varied in terms of the pluralities, provided the guiding principles are taken as given and non-negotiable. So we tried to capture the modalities and some of their indicators in the context of India and Brazil. I intentionally left out the ones for Mexico and China because our colleagues from Mexico and China will take care of those issues, I sincerely hope. So these are the 5 modalities followed in India, and these are some of the indicators that we propose we can take care of while we are assessing South-South cooperation's modality in the context of India. They are given on the note that you have been provided. I am taking them as read. I am not going to discuss them in detail. So there are indicators for the 5 modalities. And then we can have a look at the modalities identified by ABC, the Brazilian Cooperation Agency. And they have these, in their own official document, they have these 8 components or 8 ways of defining the modalities. And again, they have given their modality indicators. And I just rather reproduce them from the document itself. I have been assessed on my timeliness, so I'll just move forward. I am also taking them as given. So we would suggest that there are 2 components of the assessment framework. One is assessment framework using the indicators to ensure that the principles of SSC are followed. And the second one is assessment framework using indicators to measure performance in respect of the modalities. How the modalities were introduced, where the timeliness, the quantum, and the so on and so forth. But there is one point we have to keep in mind. This is which is very important, that SSC, by its very definition and by its very action, is highly process and performance intensive. SSC is known for its process and the performances that it follows. And the process captures the extent of the principles followed, and performance is captured by the indicators of modalities.
Your time is up, Professor Malindo.
Yes, I'm just last slide. But the point is, I must say that the impact assessment tools that are in operation today are absolutely insensitive to the process and performance, because they are very objective in terms of measuring the impact. It does not take care whether the processes were followed or the performance were achieved. It is at the end of the day, the idea is to find out what has been the impact, what has been the change. And an SSC to be subject directly to the issue of impact assessment may be fraught with danger unless and until the process and performance assessment is done in a very rigorous way. So this is the proposed assessment framework for SSC, a process assessment, performance assessment, and then you can go for an impact assessment, which the methods for which can be discussed and decided by the partners engaged in South-South cooperation. I said I must thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Malindo. My apologies. I have to manage time because I want their feedback as well, and I want to give this session almost half an hour for our interaction with floor, so I would have to manage time. Friends, now we have my panel complete. Welcome Pilani, Fanwell, and of course Noel. We started. In the beginning, I made some remarks because Fanwell and Pilani are our discussants, which is a very important role. In the beginning, I made some 6 points. I would not get into details, but I would just quickly tell you, I emphasized on having principles and modalities, why we need it in South-South cooperation. I also said that South-South cooperation is not equivalent to triangular cooperation. The third point I made was we have to have indicators in place both for principles and modalities. The fourth point is that it has to be done on real-time basis, so like GPS, it has to guide us. The fifth point I made was about localization, and the sixth point was how we go forward in terms of minimum template that South can have, though we have regional diversities. So these 6 points I made in the beginning, and then you heard Professor Malindo. Professor Malindo's brief note is already circulated in the room, so so it is there. So you haven't missed much, and I heard that the bus that was supposed to be there was late, so you were perfectly in shape and ready to come. So that's perfectly fine. Noel, now the floor is yours. Mexico is a leader in this and has been publishing reports. So you have 9 minutes.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank you, of course, Professor, for the invitation for us to come and share with you our insights on this matter. For us, it is very important to have a pragmatic approach. We are a government agency, so our approach is, in a sense, a little bit more pragmatic and a little bit less, let's say, analytical in a theoretical way than what would be an academic analysis. For us, it is clear Mexico is a country that has been participating in South-South cooperation for decades, if not almost 100 years since we can track our first international development cooperation actions. However, we have to acknowledge that in the last 20 years, 30 years perhaps, South-South cooperation has changed in its amount from being, let's say, something that was done punctually on a more political basis or something that was exclusively technical in between two countries, but at a, let's say, at a modest scale. It became a practice in many of the countries of the South. So the increase in the number of actions in South-South cooperation made us more aware of the need of having a system that actually guarantees that what we do well, that what we do, we are effective, that what we do is provides value. Let's say that's a very northern country, but in a sense, value for money. So the investment that we make in terms of human resources, of capital, etc., is well planned, and we have as much impact as we can. In order to do that, in Mexico, we established the development cooperation, the Mexican Development Cooperation Agency in 2011, and we have been developing the tools that would allow us to measure this effectiveness, this efficiency of the Mexican international development cooperation. For us, it is very important to ensure that we are transparent and accountable, first and foremost, to our own taxpayers, because we are a government agency, so we use public resources. Those resources need to be accounted for the Mexican public. They need to know what we do. And of course, we always have this skeptical approach to international development cooperation, because we are a country which still has a lot of needs internally, and many people ask us, so why do you go abroad? Why is it that you invest resources in Central America or in South America or beyond that? How is that beneficial for the Mexicans? And we need to explain constantly that international development cooperation is a system where we are building a win-win situation for all actors. It's a system where we learn from others and we share our experiences with others, but we build common prosperity areas, and we build opportunities for the Mexican enterprises, and a more stable regional context that is actually something that is beneficial for us. Yesterday we discussed a little bit the issue of migration, so this is the kind of issues that we need to approach through a cooperation approach. Of course, we acknowledge the principles of South-South cooperation as they have been established for a long time in the frame of the United Nations since the 1978 Buenos Aires Conference, and of course afterwards repeated in Nairobi and restated in Buenos Aires last March. But we also need to acknowledge that we need more operational principles, because of course the respect of national sovereignty of our partners is important, but that we, in a sense, I mean, not that we take for given, because that is something that we actively respect, but we need to measure as well our efficiency. So basically what I want to share with you today is that we have been doing that. We have been establishing methodologies for planning, for monitoring, for measuring, for giving value to our international development cooperation. And lately, with the support of UNDP in the context of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, we have also developed a methodology to measure the effectiveness of our South-South cooperation. The effectiveness in the context of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which means measuring our South-South cooperation towards the principles that have been established by that partnership, which are transparency and mutual accountability, results-oriented approaches, ownership of development cooperation by those that benefit from international development cooperation, and the construction of inclusive partnerships for development. We developed, now we need to acknowledge, and that is something that we also, I mean, in a sense, take for a given. South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation are different animals. It's not the same. We do not provide the same kind of logic. We do not provide the same kind of support, but we are part of a common goal. So we asked ourselves, how these principles apply to what we do? Do they apply in the same way that they apply to the North traditional cooperation? And we actually found out that they don't, that they do apply, but in a different manner. And we developed this methodology. We, with the support of UNDP, we established a questionnaire. We distributed that questionnaire among basically a little bit over 100 of stakeholders in between local governments, parliamentarians, our development partners, civil society organizations, the private sector, and then we invited them to tell us what they do, what's their approach to South-South cooperation. They replied, and then we organized a big meeting with them, and then through dialogue and through conversation, we were able to assess what we are doing, to make a brief evaluation of our international development cooperation from a qualitative stance. And I think that it is important to say that now the UNDP is taking this pilot that we did with this approach beyond Mexico, and actually seeing if it can be reproduced, if there are other countries that are interested in following a similar path. So adapting these overall principles to our national context and see how we can use this exercise to improve what we do. We also have we also do measure international development cooperation from Mexico. I think in the table that you showed, it was pretty accurate. Mexico's international development cooperation is around $350 million dollars a year, with this new program that we have established with Central America. That's going to be we expect to have a step increase in the amount. So that would put us at the level of countries like numerically, let's say. Countries like New Zealand, Finland, that's dimension of Mexico's international South-South international development cooperation. So basically, and I have 30 seconds to finish, I would like to say that from our perspective, South-South cooperation has to develop its own methodologies, its own approach to measure its effectiveness, but it is possible. it is not an impossible exercise. It is not a political exercise. It's a very practical exercise in order to ensure that we are effective, that we can provide as much value for what we invest, and that we have as much development impact working with our partners as possible, and that we do in a way that benefits mutually our partners and ourselves in building a better region and a better world. And then 10 seconds over. So thank you.
Thanks, Noel. We would, of course, come back to panelists. My only idea is that we follow time right now. Noel, as you might have captured from the program, is Director General for Planning in the MXID, which is the Mexican government's aid agency. And as he said, this was established in 2011. So that way, South America is very differently placed than several of the Asian countries, because like Brazil, Professor Melindo mentioned, ABC is there. In Mexico, they have a MXID, and we already had the pleasure of signing MOU with Colombia. Madame is here with us. So that way, the institutional architecture in South America is different from other countries, both in Asia and in Africa. So that distinction also is there within South-South cooperation. So South-South cooperation is also not a homogeneous entity, as both of them have mentioned that plurality is important. So one framework for assessment for everybody is not going to come. But we can have minimum sort of parameters on which some understanding is there, based on which I would see in a year or two a sort of report that gives in some sort of comparable parameters. But now, without further ado, Professor Li Xiaoyin, who has been heading not only a major program in China to connect and assess projects, he has been one of the pioneers in China to bring in the idea of assessment. He has got several academics in China together to undertake that exercise. A lot of publications and books have already come up, and he has also been guiding as chairman the network of Southern think tanks. So Professor Li Xiaoyin, you have the floor.
Good morning, and thank you, Sachin. And I like to focus on more technical issue of assessment of social cooperation here. And you know, there are two areas we need to look at when we see the assessment. One, what I call the processes, and what Sachin just highlighted, 6 point, particularly like principles, modalities, and all the issues, particularly for the principles and modalities. And we need to understand whether disregard different form of social cooperation. We need to understand whether to exercise any form of social cooperation is really consists with the principles and modalities. So that is the area where we need to look at what I call processes. With the process assessment, we do need indicators. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and because in terms of principles, modality, particularly for the principles are the important ones. For the principles, because principles is very political. The principles very political, like no conditionality. So, for instance, and all social cooperation countries, almost the no conditionality is a common feature. Melindo, you have highlighted very clearly. So I just take an example for no conditionality. So what indicator you could develop from this non-conditionality exercise? So you're going to observe the negotiations. Any two sides would provide you any information to see, well, China is not imposing and India is not imposing. So what does mean, how you can measure any side imposing or not imposing? So this is, this is very difficult. This is very difficult. And also, if you see the no interference, and this it's also very difficult to develop any indicator. So we have really difficulty in terms of measuring the processes. What those processes are based in the principles which we all call for these principles, like no conditionalities, demand-driven. Demand-driven is easier. So we can just ask how many projects proposed only by the demand side. This could be the indicator. So I like just to share with you for the difficulty when we start look at the assessment exercise, and we have to get the indicators. And when we start developing indicators, and then we find problems, and it's not very easy. Not very easy. So this is the area we see the process. And as Sachin rightly pointed out, and today's social cooperation is no longer like the situation in 1970s, even 1980s, even 1990s. First, today's social cooperation is the scope of social cooperation today is much, much wider today. So we need a definition. We do need a definition. We cannot put everything, because in the 1960s, southern countries, everybody was very poor. So we talk about the cooperation, cooperation was very limited. We talk about social cooperation, scope was very limited. And it was not substantially very significant. But today, scopes, we talk about social cooperation, but the scope is much, much wider. So with the trade, technology transfer, and development cooperation, and economic cooperation, everything here. So certainly we need a definition. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to measure trade. Whether trade apply to the principle of no conditionality. So it's very difficult. Trade is trade now. So the trade between China and Zimbabwe, China and any country, same as trade as China with U.S. And I don't think there's any difference. Of course, there are some differences politically, but in principle, this is very similar. And trade between China and India, and you can't see investment between China and India is significantly, substantively different from investment between China and Germany, and I don't think so. And this is something which we need to take. We need to refresh ourselves a little bit to reconsider, to revisit back to the definitions, and to just measure processes. Just to measure processes is not enough. If we respond to the question that, and social cooperation can India takes or China takes, really, apply to the principle like condition and no conditionality and demand driven. Okay, we do, yeah, it's good. So what happened? We still need another dimension of assessment, which I call result based. You need to understand the result, not only processes, not only principles. Because today, it's no longer the time that we only look for whether China and India sit together to talk nicely, drinking nicely. No. We need, there are people from our two countries expecting more. Then we're expecting whether, India would, my friend, some of my India friends always joke with me to say, Professor Lee, we all like learn from you. We learn from you to have this high-speed train, And our India friend to see a high-speed train will carry more and more India from east to the west. This is nice. And the people are expecting more than we actually we actually think. Therefore, we cannot only concentrate those principles and the modalities, and particularly the political principles which we had in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and we need to move beyond. We need to move beyond this scope of assessment focus only for the processes. Of course, we need to look for the result. What is the result from the source cooperation? And we need to provide the result not only to convince other people to support our actions, but also we need the result to show tangibly. And if we didn't have in 1970s, 1960s much materialized exercise due to lack of money, lack of experiences, but today we have, we have money, we have institutions like AIIB and the BRICS new development banks, and we have all the institutions, we have everything today. We have experiences, we have also financial capacity, we have money. Yeah. Therefore, we need to look at the very tangibly this one. And lastly, and we need also move beyond what I call the output level of assessment. Like how many people get training and how many people come to China, India, get training, this output level. We need to move, we need to set up, social cooperation also require a systematic assessment. Systematic assessment means we need to look beyond output, like input, output traditionally, and when you ask Chinese officials in this exhibit, we have built many railways, everything, so we need to understand outcome. What is the outcome from this output? So you have trained many people sitting here. Okay, we have trained many people, so we need to understand what kind of knowledge they really get. What kind of knowledge they will bring back, what they learn from these things. We need to understand the output. We need to understand the output, we need to understand the outcome. And we need also move beyond more outcome level. We need beyond the impact. Okay, you have learned this. You have to learn this in India, in China. We have exchange programs, everything, okay? So what the impact of this capacity building? What the impact of this thing? Therefore, we need to understand, we need to bring the linkage between the principles, modalities, and the social, economic, even political development in the country. So we need all these things. And then in that aspect, technically, I'm not going to say politically, technically. And we need to learn from North-South cooperation framework in that kind of methodological process, which have been developed over decades. We need to learn this methodology and tools and method, everything. So that is something, 3 areas I like to emphasize in this discussion, and also I would like to have discussions with all of you how social cooperation can be assessed systematically. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Li Xiaoyin. That completes the 3-member panel that has placed before you broad features as they see that are required for assessment template, the norm setting, and the dimensions of plurality. I'm very glad that Professor Li Xiaoyin has reminded us, and Professor Melindo had also alluded to that, the nuancing that is required in terms of distinguishing outcome and output. As we know, as the global community shifted from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, one distinction that is very prominent is to shift from quantity-based indicators to quality-based indicators. So we are more interested in quality of health services. We are more interested in quality of agriculture-related assistance and partnership. We are more interested in the quality that development partnerships bring in rather than quantity.